Hello and welcome to this special support section of Melee's Turn Wheel. I am your host, I'm a Melee Kirby, and today we'll be taking a look at the Lords of Fire Emblem the Blazing Blade, Hector, Eliwood, and Lyn. Not in that order, I don't think. Still haven't decided the order yet. So FE7, I'm done with FE7, basically. At this point, I've recorded the wrap-up episode. I just need to edit that down, and then I don't know, I haven't decided yet whether this is going up at the same time, or a little bit sooner, or a little bit later. We'll see how things go. I'll probably just put them up at the same time. And before we wrapped up, I wanted to talk about the Lords in an SSS episode. The reason that I wanted to do this is because, unlike most Fire Emblem games, FE7 has not one, not two, but three Lords. That is a very large number for a Fire Emblem game. I mean, most only have one. And there are like several that have two. You have like Gaiden and Shadows of Valentia. You have Sacred Stones, which you're going to be doing next. And then there's several where there's like a main Lord and then an avatar character, like FE13, FE12. You could argue, and then three houses. You could argue about all the Lords and Byleth is in there and Shez for Three Hopes. So it's a little bit all over the place. But the point I'm trying to make is that because there are three Lords, and because I didn't feel like I could succinctly talk about them in the wrap-up episode. I did talk a little bit about them. I discussed sort of what I liked about their characters and what I thought made them interesting, especially Lyn and Hector. I just wanted to do this to kind of like give my final thoughts on the Lords as well. I thought that was appropriate given the circumstances. So we're going to be doing this. I don't know if I'm going to be doing this for every single game in the series that has more than one Lord. I guess we'll figure that out next in FE8. I don't know if I'm going to be doing it for FE8 for both Erica and Ephraim, but we'll have to see. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. I think we're going to go in the game order, which is to say we're going to start with Lyn, then move on to Eliwood, and then finally talk about Hector. I think that's a good way to do it, especially considering that I think it's kind of like a good sandwich. You start with an interesting character, you do the slightly less interesting character in the middle, and you do another interesting character at the end. Which I know that maybe what I just said is a little bit inflammatory, but we'll get into that. Okay. Lyn. Lyn supports with 7 people. All of these guys support with 7 people for the record. Lyn supports with Eliwood, Hector, Florina, Wrath, Kent, Will, and Wallace. So we've talked about most of these already. The only ones that we haven't discussed at least a little bit are the ones with Eliwood and Hector. But I do want to go through most of these again because as I was rereading these for this episode, I realized something. I'm going to go ahead and say this right now. Lyn is most certainly not my favorite Lord out of the 3. I will make that very clear. Because I don't think that she gets a lot of interesting things to do in the main story, especially Eliwood and Hector mode. And then even Lyn mode, I like Lyn mode well enough, but I don't think that she's like an amazing character in Lyn mode or anything like that. What I will say is that out of the 3 Lords in their support conversations, I think Lyn might be the most interesting and have like the most to chew on and talk about. I really do think that because I was reading some of these supports and I was like, damn, there's like so many interesting aspects of Lyn's character here that I can talk about. So I'm excited to get into some of that. I guess we can go ahead and start with the 2 that we haven't seen yet, and talk about the Eliwood conversation. I actually think that the Eliwood support is a really good place to start because it gets across one of the more recurring themes of Lyn's character in a lot of these supports is the conflict between her desire to be a noble woman and to be a member of the Kalen court that can make her grandfather proud of her, and do the things that she's required to do as a member of royalty, while also not fully feeling comfortable in that role, and seeing how she handles that in her different support conversations, where in some of them she'll lean more into it, and other times she'll back out of it and end up in some of her paired endings. She ends up back on the plains. Actually, let me see what happens in her solo ending. I think that's worth checking. Lynn, noblewoman of Sake. Lynn entrusted Kaelin's rule to Ostia and returned to the plains of her birth. She often thinks fondly of the people of Kaelin. So in her solo ending, sort of her default, she does end up going back to the plains. And I believe the only paired endings, I'll double check this as we go through the supports and correct myself later if I'm wrong, but I believe the only supports where she stays in Lycia at all are her paired endings with Eliwood and Hector, where she marries them. So I think you can see this as being such a core part of her character. I mean, I think it just is. Like, I don't think there's really any way around it, because it comes up in so many of her supports. And I think that, like, the way that each support addresses it and sort of, like, focuses on it in a different way is really interesting to me. So taking the Eliwood support, for example, I mean, the C support is nothing to write home about. She just, they're talking about training. But the B support is her, sort of opening up to Eliwood a little bit more and asking him if he can, like, if he knows anybody that can help her learn some of the mannerisms of being a noblewoman. They even bring up a character in this support that's, like, never mentioned anywhere else in the entire game, whose name is Chancellor Reisman, I think is how you're supposed to say that, or Reisman, who's, like, the Chancellor of Kaelin, and he's trying to, like, lecture her to be, like, a more proper lady, and she feels a little bit down on herself about that. She says, my grandfather must be vexed to have me as a grandchild. My late mother was gentle, well-mannered, and beautiful. And then Eliwood says, well, you are beautiful, Lindis. And she gets kind of flustered by that. But Eliwood, in his sort of oblivious nature, reveals that he meant, oh, no, your fighting is beautiful. You're a beautiful swordsman. Like, your fighting form is beautiful. Like, it just came out of him like the most natural thing ever to phrase it like that, which is so funny to me. But we'll talk about that when we get to Eliwood. The A support kind of ends this on a really nice note because Eliwood and Lynn sort of, basically the main takeaway that Lynn gets from this, and the main thing that Eliwood is trying to tell her, is kind of, it comes up towards the end of the support where he says, you don't have to be like anybody else, Lindis. She's trying so hard to be something that she's not, or at the very least, she's trying to live up to this idea of what she's supposed to be, instead of just being herself. And I mean, it's a pretty simple lesson for her to learn, but I think it's important, and I think that if the structure of the game was a little bit different, if this didn't end in a marriage ending, or if Eliwood was like any other character who could just leave Lycia, I think this would have been another one where she ends up leaving Lycia, because I think him telling her that she should just be herself, I think is one of the things that would sort of push her back towards Sake, because she clearly really wants to be in Sake. He brings up when they first met in Lin mode, and how pride, how the Sakean blood in her veins made her feel so much pride, and he feels like that she's sort of moving away from that, and thinks that that's a shame, because she is kind of blaming her Sakean blood for her shortcomings here, which is something that in Lin mode she would never even thought about doing. She felt she was so, it was such an important part of her, right? Like, yes, she was a noble lady of Kaelin and she wanted to meet her grandfather, but she never let that get in the way of her pride as a Sakean, which I think is great. I think Lin in Lin mode is pretty cool, even if I don't think she's particularly interesting for the most part, but I think that's an aspect of her character that I really enjoy. So I like this support a fair bit. I also like that it doesn't like really end with a whole lot of implication of romance. The closest that they get is in the B support, where she gets flustered when he calls her beautiful, which implies really that she maybe has feelings for him, but not necessarily the other way around. They do end up getting married in the end. He is one of her romantic paired endings. But the A support, they don't really like lean into that too heavily, which I think is nice. They just have like a normal conversation, and that doesn't feel the need to like shoehorn that in there, which is cool. I always prefer supports that take that approach rather than bending over backwards to make the romance happen. Okay, the Hector support is fun, and I also like it a fair bit. This one addresses something that most of her supports don't really do. This is something that I enjoy about a lot of Lynn's supports, is that most of them, even the ones that focus on that conflict of her Sakaean heritage versus her role as a noblewoman, they sometimes bring, like, especially the ones that don't focus on that, like the Hector support and the Will support, tend to bring out different aspects of her character that I think give her a little bit of depth and make her more interesting. In this case, she shows a little bit of a vindictive side, because she talks about sparring with Hector. And, she's really confident that she's going to win because she has, like, mobility on her side. And Hector's like, yeah, well, my armor is really tough, so you're going to have a hard time penetrating it. And then between the C and B support, apparently they fight, and Hector wins. And Lynn's a little salty about it. I mean, she doesn't say... she doesn't say that outright, she's like, oh, she's pretty graceful about it. She's like, oh, losing was a good lesson for me. But then she's like practicing some sort of technique, and Hector asks about it, and she says that it's good on axemen and heavy armor. So she's clearly it's stuck with her a little bit, and she wants to beat him. Although we don't ever see how that rematch goes down. I'm not a huge fan of the A support. It's just them sort of reminiscing on when they first met, and I don't think it adds a lot to their dynamic. There is a little bit more of a romantic implication here as well than there was with Eliwood, which does make sense. I think that they honestly have like somewhat of a fun dynamic that I mean, they definitely I don't know that I would say they have romantic subtext in the main story, but I definitely think that they have that sort of water and oil dynamic that's common in a lot of romantic pairings in stories in general, right? Like they butt heads a lot, so clearly they must be in love with each other, that sort of thing, like a kind of like a Ron and Hermione type deal. So So this one did feel a little bit more natural to me than the Eliwood romance, but I think they both work pretty well. I think they both bring interesting things out of Lynn. I like their dynamics with Lynn a lot, particularly for Hector in the main story. But then and for Eliwood, I think their support is more interesting than anything that they really talk about in the main story. I'm going to go ahead and skip over the Wrath support. I think the Wrath support is pretty good, but I think it's not really very interesting for Lynn. I think it's definitely much more of a Wrath-focused support, which is fine. Lynn barely even talks in it for especially like the A support. There's just like a long stretch where she doesn't say anything. It's just him basically going over his backstory and the two of them bonding over that a little bit, which is nice. Don't get me wrong. I don't mind that at all. But it's just not, I don't know. It just doesn't really do it for me. At least not in terms of, if we're talking about Lynn. For Wrath, I think it's pretty good. The Kent support isn't fantastic either. I do really wish that I liked this one more. The noble woman falling in love with her knight sort of dynamic is a ship that I'm a big fan of in a lot of stories, especially Fire Emblem. I one of my favorite supports in or one of my favorite ships, I guess. I don't remember how good the support is, but it's conceptually the ship that I really like. One of my favorites in FE8 is Seth and Erica for the same reason. I just think that it's it's a very fun and romantic concept. So I want to like this one a lot. And I can see the vision here a little bit if I read between the lines. The problem is that the execution is just kind of boring. I mean, I don't think that they have a lot of chemistry. It's just kind of Kent like looking after her, and then Lynn asking about it seems like by the B support, Lynn has some sort of like inclination that she might have feelings for Kent and starts to like probe the waters about that a little bit. And then the A support is when they end up confessing to each other, which is cute, but I just don't think it's built up to very well. I don't think the C and the beginning of the B supports really make that feel natural. I'm willing to cut it some slack because I think it's okay to assume. I mean, first of all, we do see their interactions in the main story, and I think that with the understanding that Kent is someone that she feels that she can trust and be open with, is I think we can safely make that assumption without that being necessarily explicitly said. But I would have liked for it to be explored a little bit more, because this is definitely one of the supports where Lynn becomes more vulnerable with her feelings. I guess similarly to Eliwood as well. But I think I would have liked to see her open up more from the perspective, like, Kent being someone who's been by her side since the very beginning, because I think that's a fun, like a cute ship dynamic that they could have capitalized on, but they don't really do that. They kind of just like leave you to infer that that's sort of what's happening, which I'm not big on. I like the will support. I've already talked a little bit about this one. I think this is a really fun one from Lynn's perspective, because she definitely takes a lot more of a dominant role in this support compared to pretty much all of her other supports, where she's either like on neutral ground with everybody, or where she's like opening up herself a little bit, or on a little bit of the back foot, in terms of the dynamic. I think in this she's kind of like an overdoting mother, or like, I guess maybe like a big sister would be sort of the vibe. The Lindis's Legion dynamic is one that I talked a little bit about this in the first episode of the FE7, when we talked about Lindis's Legion, and I really like the dynamic of the group. It feels like, to a certain extent, it feels like a tiny little family. Like they care about each other. They have fun interactions with each other. I like that they all mostly have supports with each other. It's fun, and I wish that was expanded on more. I think this is probably the closest we get to like that feeling being, front and center, with Lynn sort of taking on this caring role for Will, giving him like a little bit of a stern lecture about getting in touch with his parents, which is just fun. I don't think it really. I mean, I don't think I need to explain sort of why Lynn being invested in Will keeping in touch with his family would be, like that makes a lot of sense for her character, considering that being cut off from her family in Kaylin, and then rediscovering it was the whole onus for her entire arc in Lynn mode. So I can see why she would be invested in Will, taking care of his family and making sure that his family knows that he's alive and well, since that sort of communication could have, I mean, it would have made her life better potentially, and it certainly could have saved, her family from what happened to them to an extent. Or even if you don't want to go that far, I think that she sees it as, like, keeping in touch with family is important. I don't know why I'm explaining this so thoroughly. I think everybody kind of understands why Lynn would have that perspective. And then in the ace support, they sort of just they have a little heart to heart, which I think is really nice. Fun support for Lynn. Nothing groundbreaking, but I like her energy in this one quite a bit. Wallace. Is this her last one already? Damn, we went through those fast. The Wallace support. Very fun. Probably her best support overall. And I've talked extensively about this one in the Wallace episode. And I think I kind of covered a lot of what I wanted to say for Lynn in that episode. So I won't spend too much time on this one. Go listen to the Wallace episode if you want to hear more about it. But basically, I love this idea of the way that the game presents revenge, right? Like, Wallace goes and kills the Talaver bandits, which is like something that Lynn had set her mind on wanting to do. I think it's a little weird that it never comes up in any of her other supports, to be honest, but I'm glad that they focus on it here. And I think, like, the fact that Wallace's whole thing is like, yes, those people deserve to die, don't get me wrong. I mean, like, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, right? They probably did deserve to die. They were horrible, horrible people that were causing, dozens, if not hundreds of people to live in, to die and live in terrible circumstances. So yeah, Wallace probably did a fucking public service. But just this perspective about revenge, of where it's like, it's okay to use, to use anger as a motivator to an extent. You just can't let it consume you and overtake you. I think is great. It's a very fun, perspective that I appreciate. Okay. That's basically all I have to say about Lynn. And I mean, I think that I hesitate to say that she's underrated, because I do get why so many people don't like her. The story does her so dirty. She feels like she's tacked on to a story that otherwise would have benefited, that otherwise had no reason to include her in it. I'm not sure that I would go as far as to say that it would have benefited from her not being there, but she really contributed absolutely nothing. She just feels, I mean, she feels like what she probably was, a tacked on character to fill out 10 chapters at the beginning of the game to serve as a tutorial for the dumb Western audience. And they just did not think through how implementing her like that would do a disservice to her character, or they didn't care. You know, that actually seems more likely. But on the other hand, I think that what they did with her, to an extent, actually works really well. You can tell that they did put some time and energy into crafting her supports, making her feel like a interesting and fleshed out character. And I like her dynamics with the other characters in Lin mode. I think that what they have as a starting point was so interesting, and she could have been one of the better lords in the entire series, maybe one of the best female lords, because the female lords in the series are sort of notorious for being kind of boring, which I think is, I'm curious to see if my opinion on that's going to change as I go through the series. But I know that that's kind of like a common thought that a lot of people have about characters like Celica, Micaiah, Erica. So we'll see how that goes. But I will say I like Lin. I think Lin's a good character. She's probably, I think I used to consider her my least favorite out of the 3 FE7 lords, but now I think she's on par with the other 2. I think that she's pretty fun. I think I might even like her more than Eliwood. Which, don't worry, Eliwood fans, I've been low key like talking shit about Eliwood a little bit, but I promise you I do like Eliwood, and we're gonna get into talking about him right now. So the main reason that I would have been like kind of making a little making some underhanded comments about Eliwood is that I was reading these supports, and it kind of has the opposite problem of Lin, where I think Eliwood in the main story is like, actually, that's not even true, because I did complain in the wrap up episode about how I don't think how he was very well handled in the story. I don't think that he has enough going on in his character arc to make make him feel like an interesting character. And I feel like that's true in his supports as well. I don't think there's anything super interesting or deep or, you know, enough to chew on in most of these supports for him to feel like an interesting character to me. That being said, I do still like Eliwood, and the reason is that sometimes it's okay for a character to just be nice, to just be pleasant, to have to just be likable. That's what Eliwood excels at. He's extremely likable. His dynamics with everybody are like so pleasant. You love to just see him be like a cute, wholesome guy. And I love that for him. You know, it doesn't have to be any more deep than that. I wish he was, because I think that he's one of the lords in the series that has, I wish he had a little bit more depth. I think one of the more shallow lords in the series, if you ask me, although I guess we'll see, maybe my opinion on that will change as we go forward, and I see some other lords. But I think I wish that they had done a little bit more with him. But I am an Eliwood fan. Don't worry, Eliwood's okay. Eliwood's alright. Eliwood's a good guy, and I like reading his supports. So we'll talk about some of those right now. I actually think I'm going to go through most of these pretty quickly, because in terms of the characterization for Eliwood, it really does just feel like so many of these are Eliwood is a nice guy. He has a good relationship with his friends and his retainers, and that's basically all there is to it. He supports with Marcus, Lowen, Hector, Lin, Fiora, Ninian, and Harkin. I thought he had an Isadora support, but I guess I'm tripping. The Marcus support is sort of, you could swap that out for the Lowen support too, even. Both of them, and the Harkin support, actually, both of them are him interacting with his retainers, and them, like, trying to take care of him, trying to, like, be knights that serve him. And for all of them, Eliwood says, like, I want to stand on my own. I want to live up to especially to Harkin, because at this point his father, at the point of the story where Harkin joins, his dad is already dead, so they can be explicit about that in the support. But for all of them, the implication is that he wants to step up and be like his father, fill his father's shoes, and he can't do that if he's just sitting behind Marcus and his other retainers. I like his dynamic with his romance partners. Lin, I think one of the most characterful moments for Eliwood comes from the Lin support, where he just casually calls her beautiful, and Lin gets all flustered, and he doesn't even seem to care or notice. And part of me is like, is he just being oblivious here, or is this him being like having like really strong Riz, because he has really good Riz with Ninian and Fiora actually. He's like very he's just such a likable guy, and I think that I would assume that he if he okay, let me put it this way. If he did that on purpose, if he called her beautiful on purpose, I don't think he would backpedal like that. I don't think he would be like, yeah, your sword form is beautiful. I think he would just say it. I think he would just be like, yep, you're beautiful, Lindis. I mean, and like he could get away with that, right? Because like, he could just like, even if she didn't feel the same way, he could just play it off as like, oh, well, you're it's hard to deny, everybody would agree, that sort of thing. So I think that if he was legitimately trying to flirt with her there, I think that he would have committed, you know what I mean? Because I don't know that I would say he flirts with Fiora in the same way, but even like when she starts to get flustered and when she starts to indicate that like she's feeling a little bit emotional from everything that's going on, he continues to push that, and he's like, he wants to make her feel like comfortable and accepted. I like the Fiora support. I guess we can just segue into that. The Fiora support is a great example of Eliwood just being a nice, likable guy. Because he seeing this I don't remember which support. Is it this one for Fiora? I don't think so. No, it would have been the Farina support. Fiora has been treated like dirt, as a mercenary, treated as expendable by so many people. And Eliwood like really committing here to making sure Fiora understands that he's not going to treat her like that. He doesn't see her like that. He sees her as a valuable ally. I think that the way he communicates that to her is very sweet, and I think that I can understand why the two of them end up in a relationship together. I did ask Lack about this support, and he basically said the same thing. He just thought it was nice. He didn't think it was anything groundbreaking either, but he enjoys their dynamic. He thinks that Eliwood is just a cool guy, and thinks that the conversation is wholesome. The Ninian support I've already talked about pretty extensively. I just love their dynamic, and I'm starting to sound like a broken record because I've been saying it for almost all of his support partners, but it's just true, like he's just really nice, and I can understand how, especially with Ninian, right? Like I love their relationship so much. I think both of them bring out so much in each other that is just that's just so pleasant to read, and he is I also like how this is one of the few times where we see him get a little bit flustered. He does in this case make an presumably unintentional pass at her, with the special dance, and Ninian, like takes that a little bit, like weirdly, and then he gets flustered, which is distinctly not what happens with Lynn, which I think is noteworthy. I've said this before. I think I mentioned it in the episode where we talked about this from Ninian's perspective, but I think I firmly believe that at this point in the story, like by the earliest point that Eliwood can have the Ninian support, like Ninian C support, I think he's already starting to develop feelings for her. And that's really good to see. Of course, I should mention what Lack say last time about there was a person who responded to his A-list episode who explained sort of the localization changes and why that makes a difference here, which is fair enough. I find that really interesting. Go listen to that episode if you want to learn more, or go see if you can find the post that he was talking about. I can't remember if he said if it was still up or not. But I did say this in that episode as well. I think that this localization provides an alternative interpretation of this scene that I don't think is necessarily wrong, especially if it's the one that you, as an English-speaking audience member, are presented with, right? Like, that's going to inherently color your perception of a scene. I think that not everybody has the accessibility of, like being able to read the Japanese script and understand the cultural differences and all of that. So I think that to an extent it is fair to judge the localized version by its own merits. And I like it. I like it a lot. I think it's it paints both of them in a really interesting light. Maybe I'm overselling a little bit because it's pretty straightforward, but I still think it's pretty cool. And then the Harkin support, I wish I could end on a stronger note. I think the Harkin support is honestly a little bit boring. It treads very similar ground to the Marcus support. I think I've talked about it in one of the other episodes. I don't remember if it was the Marcus one or the Harkin one. But I do think that there are some distinct differences, but I don't think that any of those differences say anything different about Eliwood. So I'm going to leave it there. I think Eliwood's a great character. Big fan. And even though I don't think he has like there wasn't a lot to chew on in most of those supports, they were still fun to read. And at the end of the day, that's pretty much all that matters. Okay, and now we have Hector, who is, I would go as far as to say, most people's favorite. I guess that's not, objectively we know that's not true because Lynn won Choose Your Legends, right? However, I don't think it's unfair to say that a lot of people probably were not basing their decision to vote for Lynn on the writing of her character and her supports in Fire Emblem 7. Maybe that's a little bit of an unfair assumption on my part, but I think it's one that you guys can understand where I'm coming from on, at least. Everyone loves Hector, though, is the point that I'm trying to make here. Everybody's a big Hector fan, and I can understand why. I mean, he has the strongest personality of the three. He's much more, vocal. He presents himself as a lot more, you can immediately sort of get what his deal is, which I think makes it easier to vibe with him, right? Because you don't have to dig into supports or, think about too much about his main story dialogue to get a sense of what he's about. And that's pretty cool. I like Hector a lot. I think that I've talked pretty extensively about Hector in the main story episodes of the podcast. I really like the dynamic that he has with Uther and Oswin, and that whole subplot I think is really good, really well handled, and a lot of fun to watch. Especially I do think it's frustrating how much is locked behind Hector mode, but I at least sort of conceptually like the idea of seeing it from the outside perspective in Eliwood mode, and then only later getting let in on what exactly is happening with that when you play Hector mode. That's a pretty fun idea, even if I think it's a little bit frustrating that you need to play the game twice to get this full story. Oh, I didn't really talk about the Hector and Eliwood support when I talked about Eliwood, did I? Well, I mean, basically, it's just them having their usual fun dynamic, which is great. And it talks a little bit, especially in the A support, about how they met for the first time. And that's pretty cool. That's a nice little backstory for them and their relationship. But I don't think it really adds much to them. The B support is just sort of an extended FE6 reference, which I think is cute. And it's a little bit of a shame that it takes up a whole support rank for them, basically. But on the other hand, they already interact so much in the main story that I think it's fine to divert a little bit of attention from their dynamic and their support to talk about, if they wanted to do a little tongue-in-cheek FE6 reference, that's fine. I don't care about that. Overall, I don't think that it adds a ton to either of them. I did forget to mention who he supports with, by the way. So Eliwood, obviously, Lynn, Oswin, Matthew, Florina, Sarah, and Farina. On average, I think Hector's supports, despite the fact that he's such a good character, and has this really fun personality, I think most of his, maybe not most, but several of his supports aren't really that interesting. I don't think his Eliwood one is very interesting. I think his Lynn support is much more interesting for Lynn than it is for him. If anything, I think you can say that it's him being a little bit more gentle than he usually is, which is something, he's usually a lot more aggressive, and a lot less, it doesn't have very much of a way with words, but I think that the way he speaks to Lynn here is he's doing his best to be sensitive, which I think is fun to see. I'm going to skip the Oswin support for now. I'll skip Matthew for now and talk about that later. The Hector Florina support is terrible. I'm sorry. I like both of these characters a lot, but I think their dynamic is just so boring. It's a shame that it's a romantic support. I don't think it's a very interesting romantic support. But yeah, we can talk about the other four. So Oswin and Matthew, I talked pretty extensively about how I felt about both of these in their respective episodes. But I think what's fun about them is it's similar to the Eliwood supports with his retainers. This is Hector supporting with his retainers. But I think Matthew and Oswin have such distinct and interesting ways of engaging with Hector. and Oswin and Matthew have such different dynamics with him that it doesn't feel like, despite the fact that some of the content might overlap, it never feels like it's repeating the same territory, right? Because you're seeing such different interactions that I think that's really fun. Oswin definitely has more of a serious relationship with him, puts on more of a protective energy, I suppose. And he like openly talks down to Hector a little bit, he just like he gives orders to Hector. Basically, he tells Hector to focus on the battle. He gets him in a gotcha over arena fighting in the B support for being I like this. I like this idea. This is something that is a fun trope that I've actually used in like D&D campaigns and stuff. I have some characters that fit into this dynamic that I really enjoy, of like the sort of servant. I guess calling Oswin a servant is a little bit derivative, but I think it's or a little bit degrading maybe. But that's basically what it is, right? Like he's Hector's subordinate, for all intents and purposes. He is to follow Hector's commands for the most part, unless Uther's commands supersede them. But he is sort of the one that has like more of a handle on the situation. He's sort of, for lack of a better term, wears the pants in their dynamic. And I just think that's fun. I think it's a fun trope. Matthew, on the other hand, also has a quick wit with Hector. But Hector goes tit for tat with him a lot more. They go back and forth and feel like a little bit more like equals in that way. Which is also fun in its own way, even if what's actually happening in the Matthew support is a little bit on the more boring side. The Sarah support I've already talked about a lot. Urk, I almost called him Urk. Lack and I talked a lot about this support in the Sarah episode. And I think that from Hector's perspective, the only thing that I really want to add here is that it's something that Lack commented on, of like Hector. Hector seems to sort of understand what's going on here. I mean, she's not exactly being subtle about it, but she seems to understand what's going, or he seems to understand what's going on, and is making an effort to not like directly call her out on it, but like to provide her the space to address it herself and to open up about it herself, much more tactfully than I would have expected from Hector, considering that normally he has basically no tact at all, which I think is fun to see. Like he takes on a little bit more of that mature role here compared to his dynamic with a lot of other characters, which is fun. And then finally, the Farina support. I don't have a ton to say about the support. What I will say is that I think, in the context of reading Eliwood supports right before this, which is weird because I didn't pick up on this when I did both Fiora and Farina back to back, but I'm picking up on it now. I think this is a very fun parallel to the support between Eliwood and Fiora, where, in both cases, the Lord is trying to explain as best they can that, they consider the other person valuable and care about them for more than just, being a commodity. In Eliwood's case, it's about, respecting that she's a person and she has her own feelings, that she should respect, and not treat herself so badly. And for Hector's case, he's trying to explain to her that he cares about her safety more than he cares about the money that he gave her, even though he is maybe a little bit still salty about the money. And it's fun to see this conversation through both lenses, right? Because Eliwood is so smooth. Eliwood handles that so gracefully and with so much tact. Meanwhile, Hector and Farina, and it's not just, Eliwood either. Fiora is a much more calm, reserved individual that has a lot of grace as well, and that she's able to communicate her feelings pretty well. Whereas Farina and Hector are both bumbling fucking idiots, and can barely communicate with anybody. And both of them are just trying to like get each other to like calm. I think like Hector's trying to get Farina to calm down a little bit because Farina keeps jumping to conclusions, but he's an oaf, so he keeps saying shit that's that ends up getting misinterpreted. So it's a fun dynamic, and I like that as a parallel to the Eliwood equivalent. I don't think any of these are my favorite pairings for any of the lords, but I do. I mentioned this before. I love the Pegasus triangle that you can do, where Fiora ends up with Eliwood, Farina ends up with Hector, and Florina, you know, they move to Sakea and become best friends. You know, that's maybe a lie. Actually, I think I've said this before. I think Florina is my favorite pair ending for Lyn. It's a pretty good one. I like their dynamic a tremendous amount. I think I kind of glossed over that one actually when I did Lyn supports. Where did I skip that one? Yeah, I must have. Huh. I mean, I didn't say anything about that I wouldn't have said that I didn't say in the Florina support. I don't think. I like how how Lyn sort of has this moment where she like realizes how far gone she is compared to where she left off, and I think this is the most she fully rejects Kaylin and rejects Lycia, even though she still, I'm sure, has a lot of love in her heart for her grandfather, and she does stay with her grandfather until he dies. They say that in the paired ending. But she realizes that she's lost so much of what made her, of what she cared about, when she decided to take up this role as the noblewoman. And I think that that's a fun dynamic for them to have. I can't believe I completely skipped over that. God damn. Even though it was stuff I already said before. I'm glad that I caught that before I put this episode out. But anyway, I think my favorite support partner for or my favorite romance partner for Eliwood is obviously Ninian. For Hector, I don't really know. I don't love any of the three options that he has. I think Fiora is definitely the worst. Or sorry, Florina is definitely the worst. Farina versus Lyn, that's tough. Maybe Farina is my favorite for him. So maybe it's just Eliwood, where I prefer him to end up with Ninian. I don't know. But either way, I hope I didn't gloss through those too quickly. I think that a lot of the supports are interesting, but a lot of the supports are kind of on the boring side. So I think I spent an appropriate amount of time talking about all of them. It mostly just, except for Lyn, which is why I think the Lyn was the most interesting one to talk about. I think most of them just reinforce their dynamics and personalities from the main campaign. And don't do a whole lot of interesting stuff with the characters beyond that, for Eliwood and Hector at the very least. But for Lyn, I do think that they expand on that a little bit and make her a little bit more of an interesting character in the supports than she gets to be in the main story. Okay, that is all that I have to say about these guys. That is every single character in Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade, talked about and discussed, and their supports dissected. I've already said that Sarah is my favorite. A few honorable mentions. I really like Wallace. I don't know if he's literally my second favorite, but he's great. No, I'm not gonna go through this because I talked about this extensively in the wrap up episode, which is gonna go out either a little bit before, a little bit after, or about the same time as this one. So go listen to that if you want to hear me talk about who some of my other favorite characters are. But yeah, that's all. I feel weird. It feels like such a weird note to end this on, which is why I think I'm going to do the wrap-up episode after this or the same time. I don't think I'm going to upload the wrap-up episode before this. Great cast of characters, and I'm very excited to talk about the other cast of characters as we move forward to see how they compare to this one. I definitely think FE8 is not gonna be on the same level from what I remember personally, but maybe I'll be proven wrong. Maybe some of those supports are really good, and I'm just not remembering them. Okay. That's all that I have to say. So I hope you all have a nice rest of your day, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.